let me put it this way, is that a lot of times we sacrifice clarity for cleverness when it comes to describing our ideas.
Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. On the show, I interview peak-performing innovators in the creative, social impact, and earth conservation spaces who are working to change the world. This episode is brought to you by Brain FM. Brain FM combines the best of music and neuroscience to help you relax, focus, meditate, and even sleep. I love it and have been using it to write, create, and do some of my deepest work. Because you're a listener of the show, you can get a free trial. Head over to brain.fm/innovative mindset to check it out. If you decide to subscribe, you can get 20% off with the coupon code Innovative Mindset, all one word. And now, let's get to the show. Hey there, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. I am so honored that you are here, and I'm really super honored to have my guest here. This is going to be so cool. Let me tell you about Tamsen Webster. Tamsen Webster has spent the last 20 years helping experts drive action from their ideas. Part message strategist, part storyteller, part English to English translator. Her work focuses on how to find and build the stories partners, investors, clients, and customers will tell themselves and others, and that's the big one. Tamsen honed her trademark red thread approach in and for major organizations like Harvard Medical School and Intel, as well as with hundreds of individual founders, academics, and thought leaders. She's a former TEDx executive producer and current idea strategist. She's also the author of Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. You're going to love the book. You're going to love Tamsen. Tamsen, I'm so glad that you are here. Welcome.
Isolde, I'm delighted to be here. This is going to be fun.
I'm really looking forward to it. I know from reading your bio, because I did not read it in here. I did not talk about it in the introduction, but I love that you say that you learned most of what you know from being a Weight Watchers speaker. I would love to start with that a little bit.
Sure. What
did you learn, and how do you apply it to what you do today?
Oh my gosh, so much. So, everything. So I spent 13 years of my life moonlighting as what was then known as a Weight Watchers leader, and now would be known as a WW coach. And I started because I myself had lost weight with that program, and I wanted to pay it forward. So in a way, it was very self-serving, because if they didn't get more people to work that particular meeting and location, they were going to close it down. And it was so super important to me that I wanted to do it. And I also saw that this was really good information that wasn't always well communicated. And I think that sounds probably pretty judgy. But it was one of those things like where I would be in certain meetings with other leaders and be like, okay, I get what you're trying to get across. And I can also see that this group of members is not with you on this. And that hurt me, because I was like, because this can be so powerful just to understand. I mean, not even to me, this is so not about weight loss. It's just about understanding how it is that you make your own decisions to pursue your own goals, really, in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And so I was just really fascinated by that. And so I made a lot of mistakes in my early days as a leader, trying to figure it out. I mean, probably the biggest mistakes are things like just be like, well, here's the answer. Just do it this way, which does not work. I think we probably all know that. Or like just bombing people with information, or, and so over time, since I don't like to fail, I was like, okay, well, how do I do this differently? And what is it that's actually working for people? And so I did a lot of trial and error on my own. I did a lot of research into things like motivation and decisions to change, and, all of anything that I could think of or that I would stumble across that seemed to be remotely related to this idea of how is it that people not only decide to act, but keep acting against all human nature, like wiring to keep things exactly the way that they are. And so some of the biggest lessons, I actually just wrote about them in my newsletter, but I would summarize them probably as 4 things. This is pretty new thinking for me, so they're probably going to change names as I keep going on them, working on them. But the first one is validation. The first one is really validating where people are right now, what they already want, how they're already looking at the situation, and what they already believe, because that's the easiest place to start from change. So I'd say, a phrase that I came up with that I still believe in, and it started there, and it really anchors to that particular lesson, which is that the greatest leaps start from the surest ground. So if I was going to help someone do something different or think something differently about something, that the most solid place for them to start, and the strongest place for me to start was with something that was already strong for them, and typically that was their wants and beliefs. So I mean, I could talk the entire time about all the stuff I learned. And I'm sure we'll come back to it, but I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons, is just start where people are. And that sounds obvious, but I don't think that we as humans, as communicators, et cetera, actually give people enough credit for where they are and why they are, give them positive credit for why they are where they are and why they do what they do the way that they're doing it right now. But you have to do that, or else people won't be open to anything else.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And it's interesting, you talking about start where you are immediately makes me think of Pema Chodron's book called Start Where You Are. That notion of figure out where you are right now before, you can't do it without a stable foundation. And so what you're talking about really hits home for me with respect to rock bottom. People think rock bottom is a terrible place. And I always think, no, it's the first time many people are standing finally on solid ground. It may be you have a long way to go. Yeah, it's a little different. And, in thinking about that, in trying to think about how I approach my own message while I was reading Find Your Red Thread, I kept coming back to that notion of, okay, Isolde, if you're going to consider yourself at rock bottom, start at the very beginning with this book. What does it mean? And I come back to that red thread, that through line that you talked about being the basis, it's the foundation. And you said something really interesting. You said in a sentence right at the beginning of the book, the best way to make your idea irresistible is to build the story people will tell themselves about it. But first, it seems to me you have to know what that story is. So how does someone do that? How does someone who's coming to their own story, trying to figure it out through the book, using your methods, how would someone figure out what their story, what their, I guess, red thread is?
Well, it's the same process, and it really is just, the way that I described it. And it's actually in many ways, the origin story of the red thread is that you figure out what story you told yourself in the first place to come to whatever it was that you're doing. And so you turn back time. Just had to share my sorry. And you say to yourself, well, what was I trying to do? What was I trying to do when I started all of this? And so sometimes when I apply this to telling a story about yourself, or the very common when people are like, well, tell us how you got here. I, for instance, remember that when I was in high school, I loved the arts. I was very active in the arts, but the arts are hard. I mean, I don't mean the work of the art, performing that piece. Of course it has that aspect of it, but that's not the hard part for most artists. The hard part for most artists is finding the work, sustaining themselves, not losing focus and dedication to that creative spark that they have it within them. And I knew I didn't have that kind of hustle. And so, one of the questions I really, I can put today's language back on it, but it really was an active question for me at the time, was how can I make passion practical? Like, how can I make what somebody's passionate about work for them? How do I make it, and at the time it was, how do I make it easier for artists to make their art? But if I look back, like, there really has been for me this consistent question all the way through. People are, I love working with people who are deeply passionate, deeply expert in whatever they're doing. And because it's so valuable and because it's so hard to do that, I really have this question that I answer for myself over and over again. How do we get other people? How do we make that passion practical? How do we communicate that power to other people? And so just even from that step that's mimicking the first step that the book talks about is like, well, what's the question that your idea is answering? And even if you don't have the answer yet, you can say, okay, well, what question was I answering? What is the question that I ask in one way or another over and over and over and over again? And you can proceed through the book returning those questions back on yourself. Say, okay, well, how did most people see it? And how do I see it? And what do I believe? Or what did I learn? And then what did I bring to bear on that? And really it comes down to just saying, well, why do I think this is the right answer? And it's in essence, the role that I play when I'm doing this work with my clients one-on-one is we are reconstructing, we are reverse engineering the story that they told themselves about why this idea, whatever it might be, was the right one.
I'm taking all that in for a second because it's going back through in time, as you said, taking a little time machine and going back through and figuring out for yourself, why did I think it was the right answer? What made me think it was the right answer? When you're doing that work, it's an excavation of sorts. I feel like I'm becoming an archaeologist while I'm talking to you. So
Yes.
when you're doing that work, when you're going back through, how does figuring that out make your idea irresistible, or are they along parallel paths, or does that part come later? Right? Because if I'm going back through and I'm going, well, this is what I thought was the answer. This is why I thought it was the answer. Me thinking it's the answer is maybe step one. How do I then get it so that the idea is irresistible to other people?
Well, that's kind of the magic trick of it, because if you can really clearly identify those steps that your brain took to arrive at the answer, whatever your idea might be, what question was I answering? How do most people look at it? What do I see that they don't seem to be seeing? Or where do I focus? Where do I think there needs to be focus that other people don't seem to see yet? Why? And then the next, and this is the critical one. Why do I believe that focus is the only way to answer that question? And therefore, this idea has to be the only way in my estimation to answer that question well. The magic trick is other people who see the world enough like you, who have that same question, who share that same belief, it becomes irresistible to them, but for a couple of reasons. One is you are supplying the elements of a story that makes sense to them. And if it's aligning with, oh, I have that question too, how do we, make the passionate practical, or something. So whatever your, goal question might be, then, and it's anchored in a belief where someone's like, oh, that's right. That's true. I believe that too. That combination of that goal, that problem of perspective, as I call it, that truth about the way things work, that belief about the world, that magical combination combines to create that moment where someone goes, oh, this just makes sense. Like this, I must do it this way, because it validates what I think right now. It aligns with who I am and how I believe and what I think about the world. I just hadn't thought of it that way. And so I have just found that I'm a big fan of multitasking. And that was probably one of the most delightful discoveries, was that when you reconstructed the idea for yourself, you were automatically reconstructing it in an irresistible way for other people. And in essence, what you're doing is you're recreating in someone else's mind the conditions that created that irresistible idea in yours in the first place. And in that moment is like, that you can oftentimes, you don't have to kind of back up, because again, it's as long as you're talking to someone who has that same question and who shares that same fundamental belief, your probability of success there is already very, very high.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
So there's an alchemy that's taking place, it seems like. And that notion, what you're talking about, I read also in Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, when he says that one of the ways of getting to yes is that's right. Your mission has become my own, right? That was eye-opening to me when I read that. And yet, when you're talking to people and you're relating this irresistible idea, it seems to me that it might not resonate. It probably won't resonate with everybody. You will resonate, or your idea will resonate with only some. So when you're doing that, let's say you're going into a pitch meeting, when you're pitching your big idea to investors or to other founders or whatever, what do you do, and do you need to interest people who might not be interested? Like, are you only focusing on
Great
the people who are already ready, are already primed, or what do you do there when you are talking to people who might or might not be at all interested in what's going on?
Yeah. So the first place to start in my mind, and this is the work that I do with clients as well, is start with the people who are already ready to be convinced. They may not be thinking about this way or whatever, but there is a group of people that when you essentially just restate your own reasoning for the idea, from that language of here's the question it answers, here's the problem of perspective that it solves, here's this truth that anchors why I believe this is the right answer, and therefore this is the answer. There's going to be a group of people who are like, yep, I hear you. This makes total sense. I'm with you from the get-go. And that's usually a good place to start, because it's, I spent most of my career in marketing, working with budgets that weren't ever nearly enough, with time frames that weren't nearly long enough. And so this is part of where the multitasking piece first came in, where it's like, well, how do I make the most of the time and the money that I have available? And it's like, well, I saw someone talk about it just the other day of like, and this actually may have been you, Isolde. I saw maybe you on Twitter say, like, don't try to convince the unconvincible.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, that was you. I was like, wait a minute, you said that. And that's precisely it when you start. Now you can expand, some people might say, but that's a really small group of people. Okay, but it's a very high conversion rate group of people. So don't discount them. Right. But you can start to broaden once you have that core story established. Then generally what I've found is that you can start to broaden the entry point for that by saying, well, what other questions that people currently have does this idea answer? And then it's essentially like drawing a route from a different city to the same one. So you mentioned you were in Brooklyn. Well, there's going to be, let's say the original red thread that you find for your idea is essentially the route from Boston to Brooklyn. Well, that's great, because now you know exactly how to tell people who are in Boston how to get to Brooklyn. But then you're like, well, but you know what? You can also get to Brooklyn from Albany. It's just, you're going to start in a different place and the route's going to look different, but we're going to end in the same place, as long as Brooklyn answers the same question as the people in Albany have. And so that's essentially what we're doing. We're saying, okay, well, what other questions, if we're talking to a different group of people, what question do they have right now? What problem are they actively trying to solve for which this idea is an answer? And then we just say, okay, well, given that question, well, how do most people look at it? How do you look at it? And this is where now you're starting to put in variations on your thinking. You're just starting to look at your idea now from the lens of somebody who isn't fully aligned with it. And you're saying, okay, well, why would it make sense to them for them to do this? And you're still anchoring this at every point in shared perspectives. So this question that you're asked, this new audience is asking, well, it's shared because they have it, and you also believe your idea solves that, right? Like, that's shared. You need to find that shared problem of perspective where you can say, oh, I see how you're looking at it right now. And would you agree this is another way to look at it? Okay, great. And would you agree that because this thing, whatever it might be, is true about the world or about people or about you or whatever, that new perspective is impossible to ignore? Okay, great. Because that's what I thought too. Here's my idea. And so it really is finding that. I I think of it as the nesting dolls, really. You find that core story, and then everyone after it is going to have very much the same shape, is going to, in some essence, contain that original story in it. But it's going to be different. It's going to look different because it needs to serve a different function.
So it sounds to me like, and it's funny that you brought up nesting. I was born in the former Soviet Union, so when you said nesting dolls, I'm like,
yeah, I was like, yeah.
That's great.
I wasn't going to try to mask her the name of them.
Oh, no. It's a weird, matryoshka is a weird Russian specific kind of pronunciation. So to me, what it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's the applications, the layers become different, but it's like layers of icing on a cake, I guess. The cake stays the same, but you're adding new layers of icing on it. So if that's, oh, good. I'm glad. Whew, I'm understanding. Yay. So, because these.
I also think of it. Yeah, I also think of it in terms of different outfits. Just so the quote that opens the book from Agatha Christie, that words are only the outer clothing of ideas. Another way to think of it is that when you find that first red thread, you're finding the shape. Like you're finding that core doll in the center of the nest, of the center of the nesting dolls. And yeah, you can think of everyone as just being a different layer on top. That's particularly true if you have to go through layers of people to get to the idea. So like, for instance, I use that analogy a lot when I'm talking to companies and working with companies on investor pitches, because they always want to start with the investor pitch message. And I'm like, actually, we need to start with a message to your end user. And then once we have that, then we can wrap the investor message around it. But sometimes we're just putting a different outfit on it. Like, so, but once you know what the shape of the idea is, it becomes a lot easier to dress it up to go to a different party. And that's what we're doing. We're like, oh, well, here's how we're going to dress it up to talk to people who are ready to be convinced. Here's how we're going to dress it up to go to the skeptics party. Here's how we're going to dress it up to go to the group of people who have no idea that they even need this yet. But fundamentally, it's going to have the same shape message at the core of it.
That sparks another thing that I read in the book that I would love to ask you about. And it's about the notion that your big idea has to be both uniquely yours and also universal. I would love if you would talk a little bit about what that means and how that works.
Sure. So the universal piece comes in the structure and the elements of the idea that you identify. And that is, as I talk about in the book, that's story structure. And it's this kind of cool thing that's happened about like between we humans, understanding our brains and understanding the world, where in order to make sense of things, we essentially create a story about them. We create a rationalization, a justification, an explanation. This happened because this happened. That's it. And it is a story. And actually, if you dive further, the elements of that rationalization contain the same elements as Once Upon a Time stories. It's, I think, this is my guess, that's why Once Upon a Time stories have those elements, because they are what our brain requires to fully accept an explanation. And then in the case of trying to get someone to act on it, you have to accept before you act. So I think we need all those pieces. So the universal piece is that structure of information is what we need as humans to hear in order to fully understand an idea, accept it, and act on it. And so that's the universal piece. And I think of it kind of like I think I use this analogy in the book almost as Mad Libs, right? There's this game, the children's game where it's, the story is pre-written, but the blanks are ready to be filled in. And so in the case of how we make sense of the world, the structure of that story is in fact pre-written. I mean, and my, based on my research and my experience, it has those 5 elements that I talk about in the book, where, you need to establish what somebody wants, the goal. There needs to be a problem that they didn't know about that gets in the way. There needs to be a moment of truth where that problem becomes impossible to ignore. There needs to be a change in thinking or behavior that resolves that tension and that moment of truth. And then there needs to be action based on that decision in order to determine whether or not you got the thing that you're looking for. And so those pieces are universal. That story is pre-written, but how you fill in those blanks, it doesn't take long for you to realize that we get to, if it isn't actually unique, mathematically, it's pretty darn close when you start to think about all the different combinations that you could put in there. So let's say you and somebody else also answer the same question. I'm not the only person on this planet that answers the question, how do we get people to act on our ideas? Heck no. But but you could differentiate there, right? Like there's people who solve the problem of how do I, get better conversions from my sales funnel. It's just a different question. But even if somebody else and I shares this original goal question of, how do I get people to act on ideas? Even that next blank that we're filling in, that what I call the problem pair, that problem of perspective that's getting in the way, it's, that's absolutely going to be a point of diversion right there. Like, well, what do we see is like, what does that person see as the problem? And what do I see as the problem? I mean, I personally articulate that problem as a gap between what we want to say and what people need to hear. But somebody else may focus on a completely different aspect of why people don't act on ideas. And, for instance, I was just reading this article, an interview with, the author David Schoenthal, who just has this new book out with a co-author called The Human Element. And I forget the subtitle, but it's about the frictions that get in the way of people acting on ideas. And so their answer, he and his co-author are asking the same question: how do we get people to act on ideas? And you could argue that it's kind of the same thing, where they're like, we'll focus more on what you say than what people want to hear. But the way they articulate it is that we focus more on the how to make an idea appealing than how do we make it magnetic? Like, how do we, like, what's getting in the way of it? And they use this analogy of a bullet where, they ask people, what makes a bullet fly? And most people will say gunpowder. And they're like, well, yeah, that gets it started. But then a bullet is aerodynamically designed to reduce the headwinds that it's facing. And so you see already, even though we're starting from the same place, we're diverging. I mean, it's very compatible, but I'm looking at what makes an idea irresistible, and they're looking at what gets in the way. And it's just two different directions to the same thing, but that's a place where you can divide there too. And, then the same thing can happen in the truth, where there's, anchored in a different shared belief, and then you come to a different answer. So, for me, the answer to how do you get people to act on your ideas is you build the story people will tell themselves about it. Mike, based on what I haven't read their book yet, but based on the interview with them, like their conclusion is you reduce the frictions getting in the way, and they identify what those are. You can hear how they're in essence, they probably fulfill the same shape of a very similar approach. But just the way that you get there, it's like, oh, okay, well, there's a universal question that people have. How do we get people to act on ideas? But those two authors and I have come to a similar but different conclusion about how to get there. And again, it's very simpatico that I was like, what I wrote about in my newsletter was like, oh, great. Well, these four frictions actually flip over into the four tenets that my approach is based on. I didn't think of it from the negative frame. I was always thinking it from the positive frame, like what had to be there in order for those frictions to be relieved. But I just look at it and say that there's just, like you said, you get to this, you're quickly in factorial land mathematically about all the different ways that you can start even from the same spot and end up in a different place. And that as long as you're presenting this information in this universal way, people are at least going to understand it. They may not always accept it. They may not always agree with it, but they're at least going to understand it. And that, I think, is how you resolve that tension between universal, which means it's going to appeal to people, but unique, meaning it's going to be attached to you. And because it's different, it's going to be one of those things that just adds, in my mind, to that irresistibility of it, because they're like, oh, I haven't heard that before.
I love that. Okay. When I'm listening to you, I'm kind of going, okay, so it feels like sort of the wheel of the universal, right? So there's one spot in the center and lots of ways to get there, which makes all sorts of sense to me. And another
I
book
love that image. That's awesome, Isolde.
thank you. I appreciate that. And what's interesting is I spend a lot of time researching and reading what makes ideas sticky. So I love Find Your Red Thread for that reason, because it's also very practical, and I love that too. Another book like that is Made to Stick by the Heath brothers, and the thing that I love that book, is so good too. What's interesting to me though is that, again, like you said, different perspectives bring you to that same place, and that Boston to Brooklyn versus Albany to Brooklyn analogy works really beautifully there, as long as Brooklyn is the center of the universe. Woohoo. So if that's if that's the case, then specifically within Find Your Red Thread, there are all of these different ones. Can you talk a little bit about what sets Find Your Red Thread apart from other messaging or story frameworks? Like, what specifically, if you can say, what is different about what your approach, about how you are describing how to get to Brooklyn, if you will?
Yeah. I think the most distinctive aspect, from what I can tell based on what I've seen and done sounds like I've done a lot of the research that you have as well, is that frame on we are building it from the other person's perspective. That in order to communicate that we're building, this whole idea of its story, yes, but we're building that story that people will tell themselves. And if you look at the work of Chip and Dan Heath or Jonah Berger or Kendall Haven or all these folks that have done great work on storytelling, and even Cialdini and Tim David and Phil Jones, other folks that have done great work on persuasion and influence. In my mind, I read that and go, okay, well, that it all really is about telling a story people will tell themselves, which is people don't frame it that way. And so for me, I think that's been a frame that's been very resonant for people, is this idea of like, oh, that's right. Well, before I act, I tell myself a story about why this is the right thing to do or not. So doesn't it make sense to just build, supply that story for people, the one that would make sense for them? So that's one piece, is this kind of build the story that they're going to tell themselves as part of it. Behind that is, I think, something that is seems to be different than what I see out there too, which is very much is doubling down on that story people will tell themselves, and really embodying the idea and helping people build the skill of what's known as cognitive empathy, which is like the red-headed stepchild of the empathy world, it seems, because everybody focuses on emotional empathy, on understanding what people are feeling. But anyone who's spent a good bit of time in therapy, as I have, can tell you that feelings come from thoughts. And so in my mind, since we as communicators, marketers, entrepreneurs, innovators, whatever, like, you can't control what somebody feels. They're going to feel what they're going to feel, but you can't really control what they think either, but you can anticipate thoughts, and you can introduce thoughts, and you can give them new things to think about, which may affect how they feel about something. So I think that the second thing that I would point out about my approach is that it really comes from that perspective. It really, in many ways, says you need to look at your idea like a skeptic would, like somebody who is not already convinced that it's right would look at your idea. And just even that shift seems quite different, even from the work, of like the Heaths and Jonah Berger. So much of it's focused on, okay, I know this idea is right, I'm going to convince you it's right too, rather than let's take the perspective of, what if someone wasn't already convinced this idea was right? How would you convince them? Like, how and why would they agree that it's right? So I think in that way, it aligns most closely with the thinking of mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said that the art of persuading was as much that of agreeing as that of convincing. Because I think that's the third thing that really sets the book apart, is I'm really not trying to change people's minds about anything. It's anchored in, what do you already want? What do you already believe? How do I validate what you're already doing? And essentially what I'm doing is removing the pain, and as Schoenthal and his co-author would call it now, the friction of the decision to change. How do I make this feel like it's not a departure from what you're doing? It's a focus. It's a tightening in on what you're already doing. It's something that's even more aligned with who you are and what you want to do than what you're doing right now. And I think that seems to me to be different than what else is out there. And when it comes to messaging and change communications.
I'm taking it in. I want to say that just so that you're not thinking this is that I have gone to get coffee. There's so much in what you just said. It feels like a revelation almost. There's a peeling back of a layer to what you just said that makes me go, oh, that makes so much sense. And again, I feel a little bit like I'm quoting Chris Voss again. Your idea has now become my own. This notion of what do they need to hear in order for it to be relevant to them is fabulous, and I love it. Moving back a little bit to the person trying to come up with that, with what they're going to say, with how they're going to put their message out there, what is something someone can do to make their message stronger? Like what is or another way of looking at it is, what do we commonly do that's inappropriate or incorrect with our messages? How can we improve what we're saying now?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. One of them really picks up on something that you just mentioned, Isolde, and that is really making sure that okay, let me put it this way, is that a lot of times we sacrifice clarity for cleverness when it comes to describing our ideas. In other words, and I love Seth Godin. He blurbed my book. I adore Seth Godin.
He's great.
And of course, Seth is very well known for his idea of, be a purple cow, be remarkable, be so remarkable that people talk about it. And, with a little bit of saltiness, I was like, well, that's great, but people have to already want the milk right before they're like, stop worrying about how purple your cow is, like make sure people are looking for milk in the first place. Then you can say, but mine's purple. And so it's kind of to some extent the same, it's a similar beef as that I have with, and it's not a beef, so I don't want him to get upset. And, like with Simon Sinek, which is like, people don't buy what you do, they buy what you do. It's like, yeah, the story of Apple is great if I'm already looking for a computer, or I'm already looking for a smartwatch, or I'm already looking for a phone. But if I'm not looking for one of those things, then this story that they're telling about themselves isn't relevant to me. So I think the very, very first piece that we always have to have in our messages, and I talk about it as like the initial pressure test that your message has to pass, is whether or not your audience understands and cares that it's relevant to them. You have to start it from a perspective of another way to think about it is like it has to look like something they're already looking for. It has to anchor in something that there is already in their field of view, because it doesn't have to be that way, but it's a lot more work to get someone to go, I know you think you want X, but I think you want Y. It's a lot easier to go, I know you think you want X, and I agree. It makes sense that you're looking for X. And a lot of times when you're looking for X, you focus on this thing more than that thing. But that thing, this new thing, right? If we can really think about it, it has this quality, which means if we really want the thing that you're looking for, we actually need to look for something with this quality first. Wouldn't you agree? Great. That's what I think too. That's why I developed this new idea. And that's how you get someone to look in a different place and not just say, look in a different place. So I think one of the very first things that people can do is it's what I call the goal question. But the reason why it's so important is it establishes that it helps make sure that you pass that first bar of relevance. Because if someone doesn't understand why it's relevant to them immediately, split second, like nanosecond, like I care about that. That's a thing that I want. That's a question I have that I want to know the answer to. They will not pay attention. You're dead in the water. So start there. And I even see it just even basically when sometimes I do a fair amount of work with speakers, and one of the things they always want is some clever title for their talk, or same thing with authors, and they want some clever title for their book. I'm like, you know what? The best title for your book, at least to start with, or the best title for your talk, is just to tell people what it does. How to improve your sales conversion rate, right? How to have difficult conversations. A lot of times those things end up being a subtitle, which is awesome. But it's like, all things being equal, don't be clever, be clear. Because there's way too much information coming at people all the time for them to sift through and go, oh, that's intriguing. Let me find out more about that. Yeah. The worst offenders of this to me are advertisers. They drive me nuts. Like when there's, some ad that is just like, believe. And I'm like, in what is this product? I don't know what this is. And I'm, most people, if they don't immediately go, okay, I have that problem or I want that outcome, are not going to stop and say, oh, that's intriguing. Let me discover further. The only people who do that are fellow creatives. Like those are the only people who are like, I wonder what this is for because this is crappy. Yeah. Sorry. Soapbox there.
Oh, no. I love it.
Relevance. That's the one thing. Yeah. I mean, there's many things, but I'd say that's the one that you can't get past that one. So I don't like to go into the other stuff until I'm like, are you sure you've got this? Let me make sure you've got this before we do anything else.
I love it. And I'm reminded of an ad that I saw that I, as a creative, thought was brilliant, but they pulled it very quickly. And it was a red maple leaf, and superimposed on it was a club from a deck of cards. And I thought, this is brilliant. It's Canadian Club. It's, it's the liquor or the soda or whatever it was. I thought it was just a white page, red maple leaf, superimposed black club. They pulled it because people were like, I don't get it. And you're right. And I was like, this is perfect. So that brings me up to, you mentioned Apple and Apple. I'm an Apple girl from way back. And that first ad back in 1984 with, all the people sitting like they're in 1984 and the woman coming through and sledgehammering, smashing it into the future, into the bright colored future. That immediately, when you saw that, think different. That was something to me. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was amazing. And I also, as I said, I'm an Apple girl from way back. When you do that, when it's jarring like that with the application of the red thread, who do you think they were going for as far as their relevance? Who was their target audience?
I love that. I love that insight. Their target insight was people who were very frustrated, who needed computers, who worked on computers, and were frustrated that the computers didn't work the way their brains did.
Okay. Fast answer.
Yeah, because, and it's very similar to, another example I use, because again, it's familiar, not because I think Apple is amazing, but a lot of times people are like, but Apple, like, iPod, like 10,000 songs in your pocket. Like, yeah, actually, but that isn't the reason why that resonated was because people they already wanted to take their music library with them, but they were limited to what could fit on, at the time they were thinking of it as limited to what could fit on a tape or could get burned onto a CD-ROM, like, cause that's what we had prior to the iPod to carry things around. And so it's like, well, people are already for people who already wanted their music with them, right? All of a sudden what they did was they were like, okay, this is the current question you're asking is like, how can I listen to music while I'm away from my stereo, away from my car? That's the active question. And then, and at the end of the red thread was put 10,000 songs in your pocket. Now, why is that? Because if we think about, the problem pair, the problem of perspective, we're thinking about format more than we are form, right? We're thinking about content more than how we do it. But the kind of core belief at that point was not only a technological one, that by using MP3s, it was possible to get many, 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 many more songs into a way to listen to it, but that fundamentally your entire music catalog is a hell of a lot better if you're out and away from the rest of your home. It's like to be able to take your entire catalog with you rather than cassette or however many CD-ROMs fit in the visor above your, in your car. That's why when they said 10,000 songs in your pocket, it wasn't like they introduced a new want. It was anchored in a want that people already knew they had. They wanted to take their music with them. And this just suddenly like opened up the window for them that much wider. I mean, I use the same thing with red thread. A lot of times I remember, I really appreciate the effort, but I worked with, a marketing consultant kind of a number of years ago, right as I was launching the red thread as the brand and the name of what I did. And I was already using this "Make Your Ideas Irresistible" line. And, they did some focus group testing with it, and they came back and they said, well, a lot of people we talk to already think that their ideas are irresistible. And I'm like, well, that's great. Those are not my people. Like, full stop. Like, because if somebody already thinks their idea is irresistible, then I'm not like, putting that out there is not something that they want. But the people I do serve are people who are like, for whatever reason, my idea isn't working. And as soon as they see that language of "make it irresistible," it's just like saying to them, put 10,000 songs in their pocket. They were just trying to like can we get it to work? And when you offer someone, I'm going to give you this, and it's kind of a yes anding them. Yes, I'm going to get your idea to work, and we're going to make it irresistible. That's what you can get. That's what starts to really expand people's perspective on what's possible. And I think that when you're going back and saying, okay, who was that 1984 thing for? Well, obviously their market is people who would buy computers. That's what they were making. And so they were figuring out, well, who buys computers that can we be for? And it's like, well, we can be for people who are not DOS heads, right? Like that who don't see the world in black and green. We're for people who want to have a computer mimic their creative process as much as possible. And so, okay, that's what we're going to do. And I'd say that in a lot of ways, think different. Even though it sounds like what I would call a change statement, where you're telling someone to do something. To me, I think it's an articulation of the truth statement at the heart of the 1984 Apple red thread, which is, it's only by thinking differently that we can do things differently. And, or you have to think differently to do differently. Right. And so they were really appealing to people who are like, I want to do more than I can right now with the computer I have. So when they said think different, that just like, boom, like rang like a bell in people's head. It's like, yes, I want that. And they've been able to charge premium prices for what fundamentally an Apple computer does really nothing different than any other computer does. What we're paying for is that story that we're telling ourselves about why it's a better fit for us.
And there's a cool factor there too, right?
Right. That's part of the story.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, what was it? Harry Shum, who was on Glee. He was, I think, the first dancer for the iPod. That those ads of like the silhouette of the person dancing. He was one of the first dancers, and that notion of freedom and having the 10,000 songs in your pocket was irresistible to many people, and choosing which songs you put on was also irresistible. So it was a definite audience that they had in mind, but it was still the opportunity to be creative in how you made those choices. So I'm wondering, actually, you brought it up, and I'd love to ask you to expand on it a little bit. You said earlier about creativity and creatives and making the passionate practical. If it is different, and I don't know if it is, I'm coming at it from a creative perspective.
Yeah.
How does someone who is not a founder in that way, not an entrepreneur in that way, but who is a creative, who is an artist, use the red thread? What would they do? How would they come up with their big idea? Especially since, like, my husband is an artist, for example, and most of his stuff is funny. He paints in sort of the style of R. Crumb. And then every once in a while, he'll come out with this fine art piece that blows me away in a completely different way. So how would someone who doesn't necessarily have a big idea, who is an artist of some sort, of musician, dancer, whatever, get their red thread across to intended audiences?
Well, I find that most artists, like most scientists, often start from a point of curiosity. I mean, I have yet to find an artist or a scientist, and I don't think they're very far apart, really.
They're not.
who you don't have to scratch the surface very far, where they're like, well, I was wondering about X.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if Y. And I think that really the exercise for an artist is to articulate that question. So a thing to note is that the red thread is very much written as a linear process. And I've worked with enough artists and creatives to make sure that I want to get this point across. It does not have to be built linearly to start. In other words, a lot of times it's useful to start wherever your brain goes first. So yeah, the very first step would be like, well, what are you curious about? What's the question that you're asking? What is the idea that you want to explore? But sometimes it's easier for people to go, I want to do this in ceramic instead of oil. Okay, great. Why? And so then you reconstruct backwards from that. Or you can say, it seems like a lot of times when people are, so I'm a huge fan of Surratt.
Me too.
You could look at it from the perspective where, okay, well, he was very curious about the interplay of how the brain interpreted color and light. And so he's like, okay, well, everybody else just uses the color. What if I put the components of the color and let the brain do the work? Right. Even there is just this ability to start to say, okay, most people are focused on giving the answer. What if I provide the elements, right? That, so if I'm going to put that in a problem pair, I would do it as answer, current perspective, what a lot of people do, elements. That's what Surratt did. Because, true statement, the brain will put those colors together. So therefore, explanation of his approach, why not put the elements of the color in play in the general shape and form, and then create those, let me create pointillism as a result. Let me create just a lot of dots of color so that the art, the audience resolves that. I mean, you could also, I don't know what his actual thinking was, but I mean, you could argue that his problem pair was the effort of putting the responsibility on the artist versus the responsibility on the audience, right? Because any artist that paints a hyper realistic thing is essentially, back to my other problem pair, giving the audience the answer of what to see. But when you put the effort on, when you put and say, just even to explore, well, what would it be like to put it on the audience instead? Well, how could I do that? Well, don't make it hyper realistic. Put all the elements in there and see if they see what it is that you're trying to put out there. So those are the kinds of questions. I mean, to me, it always comes on questions like, what are you trying to do? What are you curious about? What do you see that other people don't? What do people do that other people don't? Why do you believe that? What have you just learned that would lead you to take another thing? What do you believe that would lead you to take a different approach to that? So I think that whether you are trying to come up with your next thing, or whether you're trying to retroactively explain why you do the work that you do the way that you do it, it really is about finding the elements. That's what's most important. I don't really care what order you find them in. Find the elements, make sure you've got all those elements. And then the good news is once you have all the elements, the linear order is the one that's going to make the most sense to people when you're trying to explain it to somebody else. But for an artist, find it in whatever path makes sense for you. Explore that way. And there's just a million different ways to go with it. It's almost like applying mindfulness to the mind, right? Like being really curious about why you do what you do the way that you do it. And fundamentally, that's what I see the red thread as being. It's a way to articulate that. It's a way to articulate your personal operating system, to make visible in a way like you would in a computer, opening the control window to see the commands. I think the red thread allows you to do that with your own brain and say, oh, this is why I do things this way, because I ask these questions, I see these gaps, I have these beliefs, and this is how they all tie together. And when you can do that and see it for yourself and then articulate it for other people, I think just that it allows the power of everything that you can do and the power of what it can do for them really shine through.
I'm moving in with you. I just wanted to tell you that. That was fabulous. I love it. I'm in the middle of writing a book called The Mindful Creative. So what you're saying is like, yes, nice. yes. So that's very exciting to me. And it's also really interesting because it makes me think that it's an evolving process. And it sounds to me like your thoughts on it still evolving and still growing, which I think is great. That brings me to the next question, which is, what's coming up for you? Where are you now, and where are you moving forward to, and where can people find you so that they can follow more closely the work that you're doing?
Oh yeah. So all the stuff. Yeah. I think, as far as what ideas I'm really interested in, it's now that I've got kind of the whole thing out there are certain elements that I think that I really want to draw people's attention to, like the moment of truth piece. To me is endlessly fascinating, endlessly powerful, and what I think most messages miss. You were talking about before, like what do we miss when we put our ideas out there, and how relevance is the first one, but really close second is that element that makes inaction impossible, and that's that moment of truth. So I'm very curious about that. So that's just like a peek into my brain and what I'm trying to explore next, to get that piece even more clear to people. But general projects, it's just helping more people get familiar with this process. I mean, the whole reason I wrote the book was because there's only one of me. And yet I know now, because I've been using this process for 5-6 years, that it works for people. So the book was a way of going, okay, I can't be everywhere, but here's the book. Here's exactly how I would walk you through it if you and I were working together. So working on finding other ways to help people do that. So I've got some workshops on the schedule for later this year. I do a mastermind several times a year. There will be an in-person one in July, but a couple of virtual ones as well. And really just trying to get that out there, including, getting a professional certification program in there so other people can do this work with their clients, and help other people find the red thread. And all of that you can find, by the way, at tamsenwebster.com. You'd asked that question too.
Yeah. No, please. Thank you. I appreciate that. And you're not at Tamsen Webster on Twitter. Would you mind giving that handle too, if you don't mind?
Sure. Yes. I'm Tamsen Webster everywhere but Twitter, because somebody has Tamsen Webster and I don't know how. It's a suspended account. It drives me nuts because I'm literally, as far as I know, the only Tamsen Webster in the universe. So it's just like, oh my God, what the heck? I am Tamadear on Twitter, Tamadear, because it was my old AOL handle and it was a reference to a somewhat obscure Robert Heinlein novel. So
Heinlein.
Yeah, I always feel like anybody who can name the obscure reference, can cite the obscure reference, should get a one of the rare hard copies of my book, which but that's the story behind Tamadear. Yeah.
I love it. I was wondering if it was from Heinlein, but I already have both the Kindle and the paper version of your book, so I will leave it to somebody else if they can name it without googling. I'm a huge Heinlein fan, and at the same time, I have some problems with some of his work. So
there are some problematic things, yes.
Yeah.
But back when I was in high school, I thought it was just like the bee's knees, as
exactly.
It were. I'm not that old.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I was still in the early glow of that in my early days of college and handles. And so it was Tamadear was a nickname through high school from, others, friends of ours that, read Heinlein in that particular book. And so it just stuck. And, how Twitter in the early days was like, not necessarily use your name. And so,
right.
And by the time it was like, use your name, there's a journalist named Tamsen Fadal, and she got Tamsen at Tamsen, spelled the same way. And then I have dutifully been trying to reclaim Tamsen Webster, for years now. And I don't know at what point Twitter just releases a suspended account to someone who demonstrably actually has that name.
Right.
So yeah. Anyway, my white whale.
Sorry. Yeah. My husband's my brother-in-law's name is Harry Potter. And so when he tried to get Harry Potter on Facebook, they said, no, you have to be a real person. You can't be a fictional character. And he's like, no, that's actually my name.
That's actually my name.
Yeah. And they still would never let him. So I understand. And for me, Isolde, lots of Eastern European porn stars are named Isolde. So that's a little problematic for me too. I understand, believe me. I would also love to ask you a little bit about, before we say goodbye, the Thinkers 50 list. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's such an honor.
Oh yeah, I'm super excited about this. So the Thinkers 50, the official Thinkers 50 is a list that Deloitte puts out every year of like the top 50 management thinkers, business, of all different, ilk. Nilofer Merchant's been on there, and Dory Clark, and just the folks that you'd expect to be on there, which is pretty exciting. And then every year they do a class of 30 that they put on their radar. So they call it the Thinker 50 radar. And I was just absolutely floored as a non-academic to be named to that this year. So yeah, I'm like tickled pink, as it were. Because yeah, I mean, I think I am an academic at heart. I just, and it isn't exclusively academics on that list, but to be recognized with academics, inclusive of, some of my own TEDx Cambridge speakers, Vanessa Bones, she's TEDx Cambridge. I helped her build her TEDx Cambridge talk, and like she and I are in that list together. That's pretty great. And I'm feeling quite pleased with myself about that one, I must say. Mostly because I don't love lists. I don't really respect a lot of lists. That list is one where I'm like, someday I'd love to be on that list, and to be on the radar is just an honor beyond what I could have imagined.
Congratulations. That's wonderful. Tamsen, I am so grateful you took the time to be on the show and to talk about this. I could keep you for the next 6 hours, but I won't, because I know you have a day to get back to. I have just one other question that I ask everybody who comes on the show.
Okay.
It's a silly question, but I find that it yields some profound answers. And the question is this: if you had an airplane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Oh gosh, like 8 things came to my brain at once. I would say probably my own personal mantra, but I think it could help a lot of things in the world too. This is a long thing. I hope there's a lot in the plane to write. But be useful, be thoughtful, be passionate, be kind.
I love it. That's great. My personal one is be bold, be creative, and be kind. And you're going to hear it because I sign off on that every single time. Tams, yeah, it's yes. I already told you I'm moving in. I hope your husband and your dog don't mind.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again, Tamsen. I really appreciate you being here. This is Isolde Trachtenberg for the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I know you've enjoyed this episode because Tamsen is amazing. You need to go find your red thread. You need to go look at the website, sign up for the mastermind, which actually starts tomorrow. But also there are other possibilities for you to work with Tamsen and to learn more from the way she's doing what she's doing, particularly, as you heard here, if you're creative, because there are ways to apply this method so that you can really make your message relevant to the people who would look at your art and your ingenuity. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg reminding you to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, remember to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind.